most advanced recruiting techniques. Land the most desirable talent. Launch your company towards massive success. This is the Higher Power Radio Show with Rick Girard.
All right. Sometimes an innocent conversation during an interview can have horrific consequences, especially if you end up not hiring the person. The biggest problem every company faces during the hiring process is, in my opinion, the interview. Two people go into a room together for a conversation and no one knows what transpires. Conversations flow and curiosity carries the conversation. As we all know, curiosity killed the cat and possibly your company. Let's replace curiosity with consistency, because the lack of consistency is what breeds unfair interviewing practices by promoting assumptions and cultivating bias. So by simply eliminating assumptions and bias from the interview, we can create a process where evidence is gathered that supports the decision, minimizing your exposure to future litigation. I'm Rick Girard, and welcome to the Higher Power Radio Show. We help entrepreneurs and executives win the strongest hires by sharing insights from top-performing rebel entrepreneurs, game changers, and industry leaders, like our guest today, Mr. Victor Zhu. Victor is an attorney extraordinaire in the Fisher Phillips Irvine office, where he represents companies in all aspects of labor and employment litigation, from inception through trial in state and federal courts throughout California. Victor also has significant experience in conducting internal investigations into alleged employee-supervisor misconduct, including harassment, discrimination, and has provided recommendations for remedial measures, including preparation of new company policies, which is what makes Victor the perfect expert for today's topic. Victor, welcome to the Higher Power Radio Show.
Thank you for having me.
I'm excited to have you, my friend.
Absolutely. Attorney extraordinaire. I'm going to have to put that on my business card.
You should.
I like that.
You should. You know, you wouldn't be the first, but like today, you're like the best attorney extraordinaire.
There we go. This is my day.
Yay. All right. So today we're going to discuss a few things. We're going to talk about ways that your interview might be getting you in trouble. And then also we're going to talk about how to set processes that minimize potential litigation in the interview. Sound like a plan?
Sounds good.
All right. We're going to have some fun today. So let's talk a little bit. I talk about this a bunch, but I always like to bring in somebody like yourself who says, hey, look at, I can specifically point at cases all day long where people get themselves into trouble by saying stupid things or asking questions that are not relevant questions or going off topic, or even making just simple, inquiries deeper into things that are personal to get them into trouble, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right.
Yep. Go
so
ahead.
let's talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I mean, especially in the startup space, it's a very fast-paced type of culture. People, especially, millennials who founded companies, don't like the old sort of rigid way of doing things. And they like to create a culture that's, inclusive, that's fun, that's, casual. And I unfortunately am the person who comes in and goes, careful, careful, careful. And part of the things that a lot of startups.
Well, let's talk about what inclusive means, right? Because I know you're going to get into. I know where you're going with this, right?
Yeah.
So inclusive means everybody, right?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And it really starts at the hiring process, is where people start running into trouble. And lawsuits in California have a long statute of limitations. Things that were fine in the beginning, that you were, before you put your processes in, before you put your systems into place, can come back to haunt you later on when you're much larger 3 years later with a lot more employees. The problems in the beginning where you go, hey, we'll worry about legal later, we have a lot of other things to take care of right now, it can still come back to haunt you. So it's best and safest to start putting in processes in place, especially at the hiring stage, at inception.
God, that's so true, because I hear companies or executives say too, we'll put in hiring process, we'll put in, our HR, we'll put in all these other things later. Right. But it doesn't take that much time to actually sit there and build out at least a basic framework for how you're going to conduct your interviews, how you're going to run the process. I mean, it's got multiple benefits to it.
Right.
And there's no downside to it. So why not do it?
Exactly. I mean, I call it, an investment in the future of your company.
Yeah.
These processes you put in place, and they will pay dividends later on because you are in California, and my running joke is, best advice is to move to Texas. But outside of that, outside of taking the Tesla route, I think you really have to get dot your I's and cross your T's in
God, who wants
California.
to live in Texas though? My wife and I have talked about it. I'm like, nothing wrong with Texas, but it's like I like the beach.
That's true.
We're in Newport Beach.
Good
really
barbecue, bad weather.
Yeah. And that's torturous for a vegetarian.
Oh yeah, well, exactly.
All right. So what gets people into trouble when they're interviewing?
So the thing that gets people in trouble is, they don't have a plan. They don't have training. They just decide, hey, we have a candidate coming in. Let's just grab somebody who's here today and have them go talk to them. That's all good and fine. And I'm sure, everybody's able to, to understand and be able to do an interview conceptually, but there's a lot of risks with someone shooting at the hip in an interview, asking certain questions, especially as it gets more conversational. It becomes a place where, everyday things that we say that aren't necessarily offensive, that aren't necessarily problematic, can create potential liability. As I've seen in, as part of this great recession, I've seen an uptick in claims arising from the interview process. In fact, some of these might be potential serial litigants who just interview with companies, latch on to certain things that were said in an interview, like you were saying, without anyone else present, without a record, and latching on to these things that are said, and then sending a demand letter. And especially in our current atmosphere, where we're becoming more aware and more cognizant of harassment, discrimination, things like that, particularly say in the tech space. People latch onto that and they try to leverage that, to see settlements from these companies. And there's been, a lot of uptick in this just because there's been so much movement. There's so many people that are, that are interviewing. So,
yeah. And I would imagine it's prime for like a payday. I mean, basically, you can kind of reach out to an attorney, say, hey, look at these guys discriminated against me because I'm old.
Right.
Or because, for whatever reason. And it may or may not be the case, but the truth is that the easiest way to get some sort of payday out is to do that. And then,
yeah,
the company settles and puts it away.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not saying that there aren't valid claims. Obviously there are, but,
No.
but, sometimes you do question the motives of these people, right? When they grasp onto something like, for example, I had a claim where somebody basically said, hey, I think the music here might be too loud for you. Now, this somehow warped into a discrimination claim where, it's a company with younger people, and this claimant was over 40, and they perceived that as them, making a comment about their age. Now, the people who made that statement, I'm sure they meant the best, or they're at least adamant about the fact they didn't mean anything by it. They literally just meant the music was loud.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's that issue can be easily fixed by some preparation, understanding how to ask the questions. Because look, honestly, most people, when they're asking interview questions, they're trying to get at, whether this person is a good fit for the company in terms of the culture, in terms of the work. But sometimes the questions they're asking are just not the right questions. There are better ways of asking those questions, and you learn how to ask those questions better by, by preparation, by preparing questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I don't see how that would be something that you would bring up in an interview that would be relevant to whether or not somebody would be a viable person for the role. Right?
Sure.
By asking, hey, is the music too loud for you? Unless the person said, hey, wow, your music's really loud.
Right.
I mean, I think, why would you bring up something that could be a potential problem that's not really a problem unless somebody brings it up?
Right. And sometimes that's, again, the person who did the interview probably was not fully prepared for it. Might have been handed a resume 5 minutes before while they were working something else.
Most likely.
Got in, was like, well, what do I ask them? Okay, yeah, our music's loud. Let's talk about that.
Just have a conversation with them.
Exactly.
That's usually the instruction goes on.
Yeah. And
just see if this person fits our culture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That gets you into I can imagine that gets you into a lot of trouble, more so than asking skills questions or something like that. Because culture is something that everybody tries to hire for, but you could ask a lot of really dumb questions that could probably get you in trouble.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
All right. So let's talk about dumb questions, because this is kind of fun.
Yeah.
What other kind of dumb questions can somebody ask around that maybe that you've seen that somebody, and it's not really a dumb question, but like something that caused a problem?
Right. So, I'd say there's two types of dumb questions. One, purely illegal ones that you can't ask about someone's disability, about whether someone's filed a workers' comp claim in the past, whether, in California, whether they've been convicted of a crime prior to, making the employment offer. And then there are the gray area dumb questions, or dumb questions that could lead someone to interpret it a certain way. So, for example, somebody might ask, "Oh, hey, is that a French last name?" Now, I'm giving an example that's,
He's picking on me, by the way.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly.
And yes, it is French.
There you go. So, but
we're not interviewing, so I guess we're okay.
We're not.
Yeah,
we're not. I would never do this if I were interviewing. If he decided to become a lawyer, so so I mean, part of the it seems harmless. It's just an offhand comment, but that can be interpreted as national origin discrimination.
Yeah.
If the person doesn't get the job in the end, they go, well, it's because they asked me about my last name and where I came from, or what they perceive, my national origin to be. There's other questions, like more common ones. Are you married? Why is that relevant to the job?
It's not.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Don't ask that. Just,
yeah. I encourage people that even if somebody brings it up that they're married and they talk about their kids, kind of move on from it quickly and go to something else.
Right.
So you're not having a conversation about that.
Exactly.
This is why it's really important that you have pre-planned out questions,
right,
that you're given, so that you can just execute those.
Right. Exactly. I mean, pre-planned questions, and also I think what might be more valuable, depending on the work environment, having a pre-planned set of no questions. Do not ask this. Don't ask if, a female candidate, if they intend to, or any candidate, if they intend to have children. Why is that relevant? Don't ask. That kind of thing comes up, right? Because the candidate will look at your photo with your family, talk about your kids, and then it's natural in conversation to be like, hey, do you plan to have kids? Do you have kids? Well, that's all fine and good in normal conversation, but that's how you lead to, gender discrimination claim, all kinds of potential issues.
Especially if you don't hire the person.
Exactly.
But can it create issues if you do hire the person?
It still can. Still can. If someone gets fired and later on, they get hired, they're let go for whatever reason, they can come back and say, hey, the X discrimination based on, X protected characteristic began even at my interview, and then it only continued on during my employment, and I was terminated as a result.
And now you've got a bigger litigation.
Exactly.
Cost, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, because now you've got not only
emotional distress.
You can get
the whole
lot more.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Exactly.
And our goal here on the show is to get people to a point where they don't make the wrong hiring decisions.
Right.
Bringing people through the process so that essentially when they make a hire, it's somebody who's going to stick for a long time. They align well with the values of the company.
Right.
They thrive, and we avoid these things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So look at really, guys, taking the time to just put this stuff in place will save you a ton of headache in the long run. Now, you may not ever get hit with anything.
Right.
And if you don't, would you consider them to be lucky?
In California, absolutely.
Yeah.
Knock on wood.
All right. So why is this what would be the one reason why a company should really kind of pay attention to this, or why should they put the effort into to kind of put a system in play before they start interviewing people?
I think it's best to set these things up in advance in the beginning. Decide who's going to be your normal interview team.
Yeah.
Train those people up, make them understand how to interview, how to go through the process, what to ask, what not to ask, and also just have a template in place if you need to bring somebody else in who isn't the normal person interviewing, but who might have some relevant input for the new hire. So, being able to hand them something and say, hey, these are the questions that you should ask. These are the questions that you shouldn't ask. And, at the same time, being able to, still engage with the person, to still be able to ask the relevant questions for your business. And the reason you put that into place in the beginning is, like I said, there are long statute of limitations in California. wage claims, for example, can go back 4 years. Harassment claims can go back 3 years. So there's
and it probably doesn't matter too much if the company fails, but if the company succeeds,
exactly
that's probably when you're in the worst position.
I would say the mid-sized growth period is what I call the danger zone. When you have over 100 employees, you're starting to grow. This is when you get hit with a lawsuit. That's when you become a target. When you're a little smaller, maybe you'll be able to float under the radar for a little bit, but eventually that can come back to haunt you. I assume you want your company to be successful, you want to grow, but with that, you don't want all of that growth to be undercut by an enormous lawsuit.
That is so very true. All right, you're listening to the Higher Power Radio Show. I'm your host, Rick Girard, and for our podcast listeners, we're going to take a quick educational moment from our sponsors. Hey, check out stridesearch.com. There you'll find a link to order your copy of Healing Career Wounds. Let it be your company's secret weapon to winning the strongest talent. Our guest today is Mr. Victor Zhu, and Victor and I are discussing the litigation points of the interview. Now, I've talked about this a bunch, and I'm so glad to have you on here because, maybe people don't believe me, but when they get stuck with a lawsuit in the future, we want them to avoid that, right? So we just talked a little bit about the danger zone, which is when you start getting successful. That's when you're most vulnerable. So let's talk about how we solve this problem. All right, so let's break this down for our audience, the steps they need to take in order for them to at least, highly mitigate this risk for, this happening.
Right. So going back to what I was saying before, the first step to take is to train people. And you can't train everybody. Your administrative assistants don't necessarily need to be trained up on, doing interviews unless it's something relevant to their job. So choose the people that you want to do the interviews. Now, you want to choose the people that you think are good for interviewing. I've run into situations where, there's a demand letter and I talked to my client and they're like, oh, I knew this was going to happen. We had, Rick, sorry, not just using a name out there. Just
that's fine.
There you go. Rick always shoots at the hip. He just says whatever's on his mind. And my question is, why was Rick interviewing this person then?
Yeah.
He was in the office.
Well, there's this concept, especially in tech companies, where they want everybody to buy in, right?
Sure.
So it's everybody gets to interview somebody and they all get a say.
Right.
And I think that's a dangerous concept in itself.
I think so too.
Yeah.
I mean, in any company, different people are good at different things. Some folks might just not be too good at doing interviews.
Yeah.
So, you don't want that, both from a legal perspective and from a practical perspective. You don't really want certain people, not that they're bad people, but to, be the face of your company with a new potential hire. So you want to train a set of folks who know how to do interviews, who know what to say and what not to say. It's important to put that into place in the beginning, because like I said, the ghosts of these interviews loom for a long time after the interview's over and after the person's, gone. It's they're long statute of limitations. And it's just easier to put these things together in the beginning rather than trying to change things later on when people go, well, this is the way we've always done it before, which is usually a bad answer.
It's a terrible answer.
Yeah, we've just
the way we've always done it doesn't work. Right. So like you might as well just be kind of closing your eyes, shooting a bullet up in the air and hoping straight up and hoping it doesn't hit you. Right.
Exactly.
Like, that's really what it is. I would like to add something on the training piece. Pre-write out the questions and then train everybody how to execute them properly within a specified time frame. Because what you want to do is you really want to create a scenario where essentially somebody comes in and you execute the interview for evidence, really, not kind of subjective small talk information that I see a lot of interviews do, right? Like a lot of conversations going around, well, I don't know. I mean, it seems like a good person. He told me a story about, baseball or something like that. I mean, things that can be tied to your corporate values.
Exactly. And it's best to put thoughts, put thought into the kind of questions that you like. A lot of startups balk at, having a list of questions to ask people. They don't like doing that. And I get it. But
I don't get it at all. I think it's silly.
Well, Rick is a tougher attorney than I am.
No, I don't get it because like a lot of times, again, like I find that every interview turns out to be totally different.
Right.
And then, if you're really truly trying to make the right decision for your company, you're never going to get it.
Yeah.
I mean, you're never going to get it based off of like that, what happened before, like what we did before might work. You might get lucky.
Right. Exactly.
At best.
Right. And putting thought into, the objectives that you're trying to reach with your interviews and tailoring these questions to reasonable business objectives. So rather than asking somebody, oh, do you live alone? Do you have a family? Are you married? You can ask, are you able to travel for this role? Are you able to work on weekends? Those are objectively neutral questions that wouldn't have a tinge of any sort of discrimination or yeah. So, I mean,
yeah, I think it's where people get in trouble is where they say, well, because you have a family, would you have a problem working on weekends? Right. It's like that extra thing that they add to it that gets them into trouble.
Exactly. So, that's why you have to have a plan going in. You have a list of questions and that you're able to stay within the lanes, essentially. That's the way I look at it. It doesn't mean that you can't ask questions that are relevant to your culture. It's just that, make sure that they're the right questions. They're the right way of getting to the objective.
How you ask the questions is the most important.
Exactly.
And that's where the training comes in, right?
Exactly.
Because you want to teach your people how to ask those questions in such a way that don't get you in trouble.
Exactly.
Right. Now you talked about offhanded comments or feedback that you give people during the interview. Let's talk a little bit about that because that can come back and bite you too.
Exactly. So, it's the things that you tell people not to, you have to train people in such a way as to veer away from actually their natural way of, conversation. And the reason for that is an interview is not actually a conversation. Somebody wants a job, you're interviewing them for a position. So it is a little different. So you can't approach it in the same way. So some of the things that you might say to people offhand, like, for example, recently there was a Asian American candidate and, before the interview ended, somebody said, "You must love sushi." Now it couldn't have meant anything. It could have just meant, he looks like he likes food. But, the way you put that question forth, that creates problems for you, even if he didn't mean it. So that's why you train people to, again, try to approach things objectively and be a little more direct about what you're actually asking. That you're asking about, what your business objectives
you must
are.
Love sushi.
Yeah. So, I mean, you don't want to ask around that question. I'm just saying, I mean, it's, So yeah, I mean, that's why it's important to train people and prepare them. And I do think
those are the assumptions piece, right? Like those, I think that gets you into trouble like more often than not.
Right.
And I assume I know about you because you're of, because of what my perception is of you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, unconscious bias, all of that stuff. But, and again, it might not even have been the cause of the comment, but because someone was unprepared, someone didn't get the correct training, they create liabilities for their company. And even beyond, bias and things of that nature, there's things like, we have people who overpromise things in interviews because they weren't prepared. A manager goes in and says, this is a real case from 2005 where a manager during an interview said, "Oh, you'll be making a lot more at your current position." Now, they didn't do the wrong thing. It's illegal to ask what people made before, their prior salary history now. But what he just said was, you'll be making a lot more here without any other information, without actually knowing what their compensation was going to be. When this person started, it turns out that her compensation was a lot lower than her prior position. She tried to go back to her prior position, couldn't, complained multiple times, quit, and then sued for promissory fraud and was awarded over $1 million. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Wow. See that assumptions bite you in the ass every time.
Exactly.
Oh my God. All right. Well, so what about giving somebody real-time feedback? So saying like, "Oh, wow, yeah, I think you're a great candidate for us."
Right. So that, especially in this environment where we're trying to get people through the door and get great candidates, it's easy to veer in that route and be positive and, have a lot of, and that's kind of natural. You're trying to be a nice person. You're trying to be complimentary, but that's another thing that a lot of, serial litigants that I've seen tend to grasp on then that, hey, they told me during the interview that I was a perfect fit. I was a fantastic candidate. I have great experience. And then I didn't get the job. I must have not gotten the job because of this other thing they said about, hey, it says here that, you like going on your church retreats or something like that. It's some offhand comment. And they'll say, anything that we talk about as a defense in terms of a legitimate business reason is it's not real because, you said I was a great candidate. I didn't get hired. It must be discriminatory.
See, that's tough. All right. So let's talk about releasing a candidate.
Yeah.
So they don't fit, right? The answer is not ghosting because, and that happens a lot. But in my opinion, I've seen people get really, really angry about the fact that they got ghosted. And then that anger brews, and then that turns into something. Right. That might be the catalyst that gets them to call an attorney and say, hey, I think I'm being discriminated against, right?
Exactly.
So not giving feedback is not a good answer.
Yeah.
But so how do I release somebody?
Unfortunately, giving too much feedback can also be an issue. So sorry, bad lawyer answers to these things, so what I generally recommend, and not everybody likes these, is to give a fairly neutral and short statement that, thank you for interviewing. We've decided to pursue other candidates. Something short and simple like that. That's neutral, that's objective. There's nothing in there that could, be interpreted, as being, unlawful or discriminatory or anything of that nature. And, it doesn't invite necessarily further conversation because sometimes if you do give feedback, one, the feedback can be interpreted in different ways. And two, it could lead to further conversation in which you might say something else, you might write something else inadvertently that creates an issue for you. And this also, if someone becomes angry or belligerent and responds in a certain way, you can have your HR people or you essentially respond in the same way. We decided to pursue other candidates. That's neutral. So, I mean, it's kind of a lawyer answer to these things, but I think it's effective. And, it's especially with younger candidates or newer, less experienced candidates, shouldn't say younger, less experienced candidates. Some companies do feel the need to give guidance or give feedback, and which is all good and great as long as that feedback is, careful, vetted, objective. I think that's okay.
Objective is the key thing.
Exactly. Or
getting them to bow out.
Exactly.
Right. Like, I find that a lot of times when you tie your interview questions to your values, and you start kind of having these conversations and getting deeper into it, and people are not in alignment with your values, they will bow out.
Right. Exactly.
And then guess what? They get closure, and then they move on to something else.
Right.
And I find that like when candidates have the power to say no,
right,
that it becomes much easier for them to much easier pill to swallow.
Right. It's empowering, right?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think the reason I like a more neutral communication with a candidate that you decided not to hire, it's the same reason I like having prepared questions sometimes, or most of the time, because this way everyone's being treated equally. You're not asking certain people questions that you're not answering others. You're not giving some people a response and feedback and help, or what you perceive as help, and others not, because any sort of disparate treatment between different people, creates issues, risk for potential claims of, discrimination, disparate treatment.
Yeah. That's definitely. Well, on that, like, what you mentioned, being objective as opposed to subjective, like, eliminating scorecards.
Exactly.
I mean, I think scorecards are based on opinion.
Right.
How do I rank this person on a scale from 1 to 5?
Right.
That's all opinion.
Right. Exactly. And there's another point, I made. There's two different schools of thought on whether you should take notes during an interview. Some people say no, don't, because sometimes your interview notes, if there's a lawsuit, it can come out in discovery, and what you write might be misinterpreted. For example, if this is real life scenario.
God, I think you should write it down, and like you should record them.
Now, I tend to disagree with that.
Okay.
Now, because what happens
if you have a bad interview process, you don't want it recorded, but if you have a really solid one, wouldn't that cure litigation?
It doesn't cure litigation. I mean,
it lessens the ability for that person to win if it's not a valid claim.
I mean, it depends. What I've noticed is that usually when you get a demand or a claim of this nature, people honestly I haven't run into anybody that's just made something up completely. Yeah. Something was completely not said, never said. It's usually something that's taken out of context or being interpreted a certain way.
Yeah.
There's some grain of truth behind it, which is why you have training and preparation. But, with note taking, I think if you really want to take notes or take a record at an interview, make sure that you're keeping it objective and you're not using any. I don't like using acronyms. Acronyms that you shorthand during an interview, you write down in your handwritten notes, which happens because you're trying to drive down quickly, can be easily misinterpreted.
You should be writing down exactly the words that came out of their mouth. That's it.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's no interpretation.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
All right, Shea, we're getting pretty close on time. Victor, what would be 2 or 3 key takeaways you can give the audience they can plug into their business today?
Training and preparation. Make sure, the interview process is the start of someone's employment life with you. You want to start that out right. So you want that to be, and that's where your risk also begins. So you want to prepare and get your folks ready. So train and select your hiring and interviewing team. Prepare outlines for them, prepare question outlines, prepare a don't say outline. And 3, end your, if a candidate's not hired, provide a neutral, objective response informing them that they were not hired.
And there you go. Boom. Victor, thanks so much for your time and investment today. And we'll welcome you to the Higher Power Radio community. Now, what would be the best way in which members of the audience can find you, your firm, what have you?
Yeah, absolutely. You can reach out to me by email, by phone, on LinkedIn as well. Happy to grab coffee or lunch with anybody who wants to.
Perfect. And we'll have the links in the show notes. Hey, thank you for tuning in this week's episode of Higher Power. Quick thanks to our team, Brian Colburn, Andrea Ballin, and Ayla Gerard. If you're listening to the podcast, please subscribe, review, and share. After all, this show's for you. And we want to continue to bring valuable content to you every week. You can join the Higher Power Radio community at Hire, H-I-R-E, Power, P-O-W-E-R, radio, R-A-D-I-O.com. Or you can drop me an email at rick@stridesearch.com. Tune in next Tuesday. Our guest is going to be Varun Puri. Varun is the co-founder of Yodely. I'm your host, Rick Gerard, and you have been listening to the Higher Power Radio Show. Aloha. Aloha.
Thank you for listening to Higher Power Radio. Catch our LinkedIn Live show every Tuesday at noon or download the podcast on iHeartRadio, iTunes, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. We appreciate you joining us on Higher Power Radio with your guide to recruitment success, Rick Gerard.